Welcome to the NOAA Science Seminar, Places Forgotten by History, the Archaeological Potential of Submerged Landscapes, which will be a discussion on recent efforts to map and illustrate paleo landscapes along the northwestern Gulf of Mexico. This seminar series is co-hosted by NOAA Ocean Exploration and the NOAA Central Library. And my name is Logan Kline, and I'm a Knauss Marine Policy Fellow working at NOAA Ocean Exploration in the Science and Technology and Outreach and Education divisions. I'm really excited to introduce to you our seminar speaker for today, Dr. Amanda Evans. Dr. Evans has over 20 years of experience as an underwater archaeologist and has worked across the Southeast, Great Lakes, and the Gulf and Atlantic coasts of the United States, as well as the Caribbean and the Mediterranean. She currently serves as the Maritime Services Practice Leader for Gray and Pape, Inc., a small business enterprise with over 35 years of experience specializing in a national and international practice that delivers cultural heritage management services to public and private industry clients. Dr. Evans' project was supported via the NOAA Ocean Exploration Fiscal Year 2018 funding opportunity. Thank you so much, Dr. Evans, for your time and for choosing to share your exciting work with us, and I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Logan. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk today about the project. It's something that's of significant interest to me. It's something that I've focused on for a long time, and so I'm excited to share it. Let's see. Trying to advance my slides here. All right, there we go. Obviously, I'm the talking head today, but I do want to recognize that this project is dependent upon the collaboration of a lot of different specialties. My co-PI, Mr. Rich Weinstein, we worked with fantastic marine geophysicists from Wessex Archaeology in the UK, Louise Tizard and Megan Metcalf, our geoarchaeologist, Dr. Gus Costa, who you will see later on in this presentation. And then we also had significant support for outreach and education through the University of West Florida, Dr. Remy Goujon and Dr. Greg Cook. That being said, all mistakes are mine today. So I realize it may seem a little strange to be invited to a marine science symposium that focuses on the exploration of dry land, but I promise it's all going to make sense because the places that we're talking about used to be dry land before they were drowned by sea level rise associated with the melting of the glaciers at the last glacial maximum, or as it's more popularly known, the last ice age. And I promise that's the last pun. So because marine scientists have done extensive work on sea level changes throughout global history, we have a pretty good idea of the changes that have occurred over time. And we do recognize that there are global, regional, and local variations in sea level rise. It's not a uniform change, but based on different data sets, ice cores, peats, corals, we can track the movement of shorelines over time. And essentially what we're able to determine is that if we look back at known human history in North America, or should I say, archaeologically documented human habitation of North America. If we go back to about 14,000 years, then land from the modern shoreline all the way out to about 120 meters or 400 feet is all land that would have been exposed as dry land and available for occupation. And I realize it's a little difficult to think in terms of a bar graph. So if we look at different mapping, and hopefully you can see my cursor on here, the brown and the orange contours, these are contours from publicly available NOAA bathymetry data. And the brown and the orange contours represent the portions of the continental shelf out to about that 120 meter depth. So that all would have been dry land at the glacial maximum. The blue is what would have been the shoreline at that time. And you can see that there are significant areas of exposure off of Texas and Louisiana. Florida was twice as large as it was today. And then the New England area was significantly larger. I did want to make reference to California. It has a very narrow continental shelf, but there is still expanded area. And then Alaska, if we think about having learned about the Bering Land Bridge, you can see that in the contours, although the data is specific to the United States, so it is cut off here. It's not that the data disappears, it's just we don't have it for Russia. So today I'm specifically going to be talking about the northwestern Gulf Gulf of Mexico, so offshore of Texas and Louisiana, essentially from Houston to Lafayette, Louisiana. Archaeologists have taken an interest in modeling sea level stands as it relates to pre-contact occupations in North America. And they've modeled out where those different shoreline stands may have been. And what's interesting about this is that you can see a significant portion of land off of Texas, Louisiana, and Florida that's now submerged that would have been available for occupation. So what does that have to do with marine exploration and archaeology? Well, let's just look at some of the facts about coastal areas. Today, about 128 million people in the United States, or about 40% of the US population, lives in a coastal county. And coastal counties account for just 10% of the US mainland, excluding Alaska and Hawaii. And that pattern trends worldwide. As of 2007, approximately 40% of the world's population lived within 100 kilometers, or 62 miles, of a coastline. Now, we understand that these are modern patterns, but we do have evidence that those patterns are found throughout history. And so if we start to think about those numbers, where were people living? Where were they concentrated? With the amount of land that would have been exposed as dry land, you can start to see off of Texas and Louisiana, up to 200 kilometers of land was at one time exposed that is now underwater. Off of Florida, it's up to 280 kilometers. So really, if we start talking about patterns of human behavior in the pre-contact period, and we want to know if people had coastal adaptations, the places that we would find that evidence are underwater today. If we talk about coastal populations from the Paleo-Indian or the Archaic periods in human history, from what is the modern coastal zone in Texas and Louisiana, we're actually talking about the sites that would have been much farther inland. The coastal area hasn't been accessible to us in large part. And so that introduces significant sampling bias within archaeology. A lot of our patterns are based on a lack of evidence. And from an exploration standpoint, that's a pretty significant challenge. There's also a somewhat practical aspect to this type of research, and that is that our continental shelves don't just sit there in stasis. We are actively developing and impacting these landscapes through energy extraction, sand mining for coastal restoration and resources. We've even historically dumped our materials, unexploded ordnance, other junk, just gets dumped out of sight. And now we're re-encountering those materials. If you look at the bottom map, what you're seeing is the coast of Texas and Louisiana. Those red lines are all pipelines that have been installed. We've got about 80 years almost now of offshore oil and gas industry activities, as well as sand mining. We're now looking at possible wind energy off of Louisiana, at least. There were 3 leases, and the one buried underneath the pipelines here off of Louisiana, that's the one that was leased most recently. And if you're tracking the news on offshore wind off the Atlantic coast, all of those leases are on areas that were exposed as dry land at the last glacial maximum, and probably for a significant period of time afterward. And so we also have to consider that these submerged landscapes may have connections to modern tribal populations who have an interest in these ancestral lands. So the study that we're talking about today really had its roots in earlier work. Because of the oil and gas extraction activities, research into submerged landscapes in the northwestern Gulf has been ongoing since about the late 1970s. And the first study was published in 1986 that really addressed geophysical and geotechnical exploration of these types of landscapes. And you see those here in the yellow box. Up here, this was in about 10 meters of water currently. And then a follow-up study done, published in 2016, looked at areas in about 15 meters of water and 30 meters of water. Now, the majority of the work that was done for both of these studies involved remote sensing data or geophysical data survey. They also included sediment coring specifically to recover samples that could be examined archaeologically. And there were 106 sediment cores total between the two projects that have been collected. They were approximately 4 inches in diameter, 20 feet in length. And that sounds like a lot, 106, but in terms of surface area, it's the equivalent to 11 shovel tests, which if you're familiar with archaeology, that's less than a day's worth of work. So our project began a lot like any other project. We had to do our homework. We started with a desktop analysis of previous survey data. And that survey data largely came from the oil and gas industry survey reports that have been prepared and provided to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and its predecessors, Minerals Management Service, in part compliance with the regulatory process, the permitting process for those projects. So we were able to see what data quality looked like in different areas and what types of representative landforms we could see in the data. We also reached out to other colleagues that we knew were conducting complementary research to make sure that we weren't duplicating our efforts. We spent a lot of time in the survey planning process. Line spacing and orientation do play an impact on your ability to detect features. Obviously, coarser line spacing, you're able to cover more area, get a general idea of what's happening. But if you have a feature of interest, you want to have tighter line spacing so that you get more detail over the area. We also wanted to estimate our mobilization and transit time and plan that into the data acquisition. We wanted to maximize the amount of time that we'd be able to spend in data collection. At the end of this, we ended up with 8 priority survey areas, and the survey areas included a mix of those regional long lines and smaller detailed sections within the regional lines. We were able to survey 11 in the field. We tried to be optimistic, or I should say we tried to be conservative with 8, but we were prepared to do more. And as you can see from the NOAA chart snippet that's in here, there are some practical considerations to think about. One of our high priority survey areas is on the margin of a shipping channel. And so with a lot of that vessel traffic moving up and down the channel, trying to tow equipment and conduct survey operations in those areas can be a little bit complicated. You're having to work around other vessels and give the right of way. So all of that factored into our survey planning. We also wanted to be very deliberate about our equipment selection because we were really looking at an exploration-focused project. We got to do a little bit of experimentation. The sub-bottom profiler, a chirp sub-bottom profiler, has really been a standard piece of equipment in offshore survey for decades. It's very reliable. It provides good, consistent data within the sediments that we're surveying. Obviously, any technology is going to be specific to the environmental conditions, the sediment conditions, and the survey plan. More recently, parametric sub-bottom has been used with increasing frequency, especially by our colleagues operating in the North Sea and the North Atlantic, because of its ability to more finely resolve the near surface features. And we wanted to know if that was something that would provide significant advantage in the Gulf of Mexico. And so by towing both systems relatively in line with one another, we were able to make almost direct comparisons of the data. We also collected single beam bathymetry data so that we'd have water depth data to then calculate into total depth of features below the seafloor to put into comparison with those sea level curves so that we could use them to approximately place those features within time. And then finally, a magnetometer. The magnetometer had nothing to do with looking for submerged landscapes. It was entirely for identifying potential hazards that would prohibit us from coring in certain places. Again, we've got over 30,000 line miles of pipelines, we've got transmission cables, communications cables, and unfortunately, just junk on the seabed. And we didn't want to put ourselves in danger by accidentally drilling into something like that. The objectives of our survey were pretty pretty straightforward. We knew from the desktop research that we had chosen areas that had a high likelihood of having incised valley features or other features of interest, or they had had specific features already called out but not further investigated. So we wanted to know if we could relocate those features, and we wanted to conduct further exploration. The two projects that had been done really focused on the shoreward side of an entrenched valley, which I think I have on a later slide. And we wanted to look seaward of that. We wanted to see if there was a difference in the data, a difference in the preservation potential. And again, we wanted to be able to make those direct data comparisons to see if sub-bottom profile or parametric sub-bottom had significant advantages over one another. Now, the best laid plans never go off according to plan. We did our best to identify potential risks up front as part of our planning process, down to requesting the bolt pattern for the flange for the parametric sub-bottom, which was the only rental piece of equipment that we were using. Everything else was owned by the marine survey contractor that we used. Unfortunately, the parametric unit that we were going to use failed its bench test. The rental company was fantastic. They got us a brand new replacement unit that was a different model. And suddenly we were in a situation where the flange didn't fit. And it's just one of those things. It happens. Luckily, we were able to get a welder on site and get that taken care of. So pretty soon, we were on our way. And if this looks boring, boring is good. In talking with NOAA about the expedition website and expedition pages for public outreach as part of this project, we were trying to sort of plan out the different photographs and things that we could provide to show the public what we were doing. And I pretty much prepared them for cables trailing into water, poles being dragged through the water. Those are our sensors operating. Very pretty sunsets. Our vessel was equipped for 24-hour operations. We had 2 complete shifts of staff on board, so we were able to operate. So here we had some dynamic photos of equipment being deployed, very safely, of course. And this is how we spent the majority of our time, sitting in front of screens. We were monitoring all of the data acquisition as it was coming in, looking at it in terms of our planning data, so where we thought the features would be located, mapping them out, adjusting the survey plans in the field. If we weren't seeing anything, we would cancel lines and move on to a different area. And if we were seeing more than we expected, that gave us the flexibility then to add additional lines. So as a result of the geophysical field work, we ended up collecting about 670 line kilometers of survey transects. And that was every sensor, 670 line kilometers. The good news is we found incised features in every grid that we looked in. Not all of them are significant. Not all of them exhibit high levels of preservation, but they're there. We did find that we had better resolution of the features seaward of that relic Sabine Valley, which was interesting to us. Perhaps because there's higher sand content shoreward, that could be. The chirp, we expected it to provide reliable data, and it did. The parametric, though, exceeded our expectations. Our colleagues from the UK were very surprised to see the depth of penetration we were able to achieve. And we attribute that to the sediments having more silt and clay content than the gravels and boulders that are characteristic of the North Atlantic and the North Sea. Ultimately, our problem was we ended up with too much data. We were able to survey almost consecutively for 10.5 days. We did lose the last day due to weather, but offshore, 1 out of 12 isn't bad. And I realized that my choice of sub-bottom picture may not be the greatest because this guy is pretty beat up. You can see here, he's kind of covered in seaweed. He's seen a lot of action, but again, just as reliable. And if you're of a certain age like me, you might remember the line Timex watches, takes a licking and keeps on ticking. It's pretty much what we had. I do want to point out our fantastic survey crew. The scientists, we can't do it alone. We need our vessel captains who can drive straight survey transect lines in really challenging conditions sometimes. The geophysical operators who help deploy all of the equipment, the cook the engineer, the deckhands, everybody. It's a team effort. And so what we ended up with were some interesting data comparisons. And if you're kind of wondering what you're looking at, there's not much to see in this photo. These are direct comparisons of the chirp profiler data and the parametric data right below that. You see that the parametric gives you a more detailed view of a smaller vertical area. The chirp provides more context to what's happening down below. But again, we see an entrenchment here, a potential valley, and the margins have been truncated. There's not much to see here. On the other hand, what we found with the data comparisons is that most of us would not opt for one system over the other. We'd be really greedy and we would want both. And I'll show you why. Because in this profile section, we have an oyster deposit, probably a reef. We haven't found anything to suggest that it's an archaeological midden, but it's located over here on the left-hand side. And with the chirp data, you get a more strongly reflective surface underneath the margin of that embayment or channel feature. The oyster deposit is just visible on top. In the parametric, it almost shows up as an acoustic void or a blank spot in the data. But putting these together, not only were we able to have a repeatable feature, but it was consistently the same size and shape, which in assessing acoustic data and looking at reflection patterns of sound, repeatability is a good marker of a real feature in or on the seabed. We also had some very interesting complex channeling features. And sort of the next challenge then is how to take this data and present it in accessible formats and produce products that not only convey the scientific information, but are publicly accessible. And in some cases, we can do that using contours. What you see here, this is the bottom left-hand image is from the 2016 study. And what you see at the top in the black and white, the grayscale, that is from this most recent study. So we were able to relocate and add to the contouring of the existing channel feature. We expected that it would extend farther to the west. These images are both north up, I should add. And what we expected was that this channel feature, sort of on the top midsection of the older data, would continue to the east, and it did. We do see that, if you can see my cursor, it's following the black line. And it also seems to turn, or a second feature extends to the south and the southeast. Now, the contours do not show as tight or constrained of a feature in the two new areas, and that's due to data density. That first image, the 2016, was based on multiple data sets, including a research data set. The new data is just from our most recent survey. So again, some of the challenges with presenting the information. We're also working on fence diagrams and renderings, surface renderings, and we can do a lot of different things. We can play with really exaggerated color scales, and that's what you see at the bottom. It's actually quite garish, to try to tease out some of these features. But ultimately, what we're really looking at are the acoustic reflections, and these are relative to the environment. So everything is based on the speed of sound and the speed and strength of the return signal once it bounces off of something to come back to the sensor. Until we're actually able to take sediment cores, we don't really know exactly what the sediments are or what they date to, which meant we were going back out into the field. We did essentially what's we called a double-blind interpretation. We interpreted the chirp data, we interpreted the parametric data, and then we put them side by side to see what we came up with and where we had agreement in the data and where we might see things in one data set that we hadn't noticed the first time. Because of, obviously, this is all had to be planned in advance and budgeted for, we planned for 30 cores. However, once we were on the vessel, we were able to acquire 39. That was great in terms of having more data. It just meant we also had a lot more stuff to process in the lab after the fact. We were trying to test both interpreted features and in some cases, just acoustic reflectors. where we thought we might know what it was, but we wanted to see. And in some cases, it just turned out to be really, really dense clay. We had 5 days at sea, and this time we were working daylight operations only. And you can see the coring unit that we use. The marine survey contractor has a jumbo piston core, and the torpedo-looking object is a 2,000-pound counterweight that helps to drive the piston core into the bottom to capture sediment. These cores were about 3.5 inch diameter, so similar to what's been acquired previously, and again, 20 feet in length, I should say. On the vessel, I'm really sorry, I did not get a group photo of everyone on this crew, but I do want to recognize that the crew that we had worked diligently and safely to really help us exceed our expectations. Here you can see the coring crew. They're actually sliding a core liner up that 20-foot barrel to prepare for a new core. There's not a lot that you can do on the vessel, but you can make observations as the core is being recovered, as it's being sectioned into pieces. And in this case, we were able to identify pieces in the core catcher itself. This is essentially a nose cone that fits inside the bit of, or the pointy end of the core barrel. And this keeps material from sliding back out. And in this case, it actually prevented a large chunk of wood from sliding too far up the core. We've always wondered whether or not, if you were to find projectile points or lithic material, lithic stone tools in a buried context, if a core would even be able to recover them. In this case, it did capture something. In this case, you can see it's about 4 inches long, about an inch, inch and a half wide. That's a relatively large object. Now, it wasn't in its correct place. It got drugged down a little bit, but it was recovered, which was interesting. Because our coarse barrel liners are clear, we could see gross sediment changes, so we could start to see if we were in the right ballpark or if we were just recovering marine muds and sands. Because the core barrels are 20 feet long, they're sectioned on the boat, which is what you see in that bottom middle picture, just slicing through the core, capping it on both ends, and sealing the ends. And in some cases, we were able to see where we had cored through shell deposits. We did have both oyster and range's shell deposits. And then everything got inventoried, cataloged, and labeled on the vessel before we left site. And you can see we've got a lot of our core barrels, core sections labeled and ready to go back to the lab. Before we even opened the cores, we ended up running them through a multi-sensor core logger to pick out different data sets like bulk density, magnetic susceptibility, electrical resistivity. And what that does is it allows us to identify strata within the cores that aren't visible to the naked eye. Here we have 2 cores from the same survey area within about 100 meters of one another. To the naked eye, they seem to have very similar sediment colors, sediment types, stratigraphy, but we can see in the magnetic susceptibility that there is a change at the bottom, suggesting something, some other type of deposit, whether it's an interruption in time, and that's typically what you see in magnetic susceptibility. It's used as a proxy for climate conditions. It can also indicate sources of sediment and other materials within the deposition, or where you have severe changes in the profile that can illustrate a disruption, either an erosional event or some sort of disturbance in deposition that changed the profile. Once that was done, the cores were all taken to the lab where we started splitting everything. As cores were split, they were immediately logged, they were photographed, and then archived and inventoried again prior to subsampling. And for subsampling, we did standards things like radiocarbon dating. Did the horizon of interest, if it looked like a former land surface, what time period did it date to? Does it represent a potential human habitation surface? For the different shells, what species were they? Is it a species that was known to have been exploited by early human populations? Is it something that we would only find in a marine context? Is it something that is from an estuarine context? what information can we tease out of those materials? Also doing point count and micromorphological analyses, looking within the sediments themselves to see their constituents. Macrobotanicals, we did sample through several peat deposits, and those plant species can tell us a lot about the environment surrounding the coring location. Obviously, pollen can get blown into a location, but we can tell more about the vicinity of that area, what it was like, what plants were growing, and then from that, what animals may have been coming to that area to exploit those plants. And then finally, as core halves have been sampled, they've been screened just to make sure that we're not missing anything else inside of those sediments. And we do have a short video showing, so sorry, Gus, for that. Here is Dr. Gus Costa. He is in the lab and going through the process of logging and sampling cores. He's cleaning sections. He doesn't normally work this fast. This has actually been sped up just for us. But it does give you an idea of the amount of time and effort that it takes to properly log these cores. And again, we had 39 cores and I want to say 148 sections of core, each one then split in half, and then taking photographs. And you want to make sure that you photograph these almost immediately upon opening and cleaning, because as they start to dry out, the colors change. So in addition to the exploration and the investigation into these features, OER really emphasizes training of the next generation of scholars. And so what we wanted to do was make sure that we were providing opportunities for other professionals, for new students, and for the public at large to learn about this process. Unfortunately, there's always going to be space limitations offshore. You can only fit so many people safely on the boat to do the work. There are insurance limitations and safety certifications that have to be had. But we were able to put one early career scientist on each of the cruises that we conducted. And so what we really looked for were lab work and data-driven opportunities to provide training. And we were able to do that through a graduate assistantship at the University of West Florida for a student interested in submerged paleolandscapes. Graduate lab work that was on top of anything else that was being done under the grant, and then a short course for students and early career professionals. And we had originally been awarded this contract in 2018. That was our kickoff. And of course, as we're getting ready to do the short course, the world ground to a halt for COVID. But what that offered us an opportunity to do was reschedule it later. We did this last August, August of 2022, I should say. And it also allowed us to reconfigure the budget to offer it at a very, very modest fee to professionals. Students were paid for by the grant. So for the student training opportunity, graduate students and graduate schools are really emphasizing what are called high impact practices. And I have to thank my colleague, Dr. Remy Goujon, for telling me all about this. He has been supervising students in the lab who have been conducting grain size and shell analyses from samples that were prepared by Dr. Costa and sent to the University of West Florida. Dr. Costa and I have been able to meet with the students remotely via Zoom or GoToWebinar, since that's the platform we're on, to provide information and training about the background of the project, the way that the cores were collected, what has been done to the sediments since, and what their efforts will inform for the rest of the project. Again, this is very student-driven, and it will result in a student-led conference paper and manuscript. So we are going to provide opportunities for those students to present professionally to the community, but also to have manuscripts on this work. The Submerged Landscape short course, we wanted to make sure that this had some credit hours given. That way, if current graduate students needed it or wanted it, it would contribute to their overall education. But we wanted it open to both students and professionals. There's very little formal training in this topic. A lot of the professionals that are doing it, we have cobbled together our own educational pathways at traditional universities that may not have anyone else doing this topic, but we're able to pull that together. A lot of people are learning on the job. Initially, we wanted it to be a longer event, 1 to 2 weeks, but really that's a heavy ask for people. So it ended up being a 4-day in-person event. It was advertised to students and early career professionals. Again, we were able to offset costs for the students by paying tuition through the grant, and then offset costs for everyone else to keep that down. Attendees did have to pay for their travel expenses though, and that was one reason we condensed that schedule. It was to minimize the costs to the participants. And we had an amazing group of colleagues and professionals who helped out with this short course. Their names are all listed here, but these people gave their time and their passion for the subject and came and presented on various topics throughout geology, archaeology, climatology. We were able to speak with people in the industry working on these submerged landscapes projects to give their perspective. We were also fortunate to have Mr. Dave Ball of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, whose agency regulates a lot of this work on the outer continental shelf, to come and give a different perspective, and also to talk specifically about tribal engagement and what this information means to traditional owners of these ancestral lands. We are still continuing with some of these efforts. The data synthesis, again, there's a lot of data. That's partly our fault because we came back with more than we planned. Manuscript and graphics preparation, again, trying to go beyond just sort of the traditional annotated seismic profiles to come up with more 3D renderings and more publicly accessible illustrations. And we have put in for an organized session at next year's Society for American Archaeology conference in New Orleans. So hopefully we'll be able to present more academic findings to another audience at another time. And so with that, I have to thank NOAA OER for funding for this project, my colleagues for all of their hard work going into the results that I had the opportunity to present today, and my email address is here in case anyone has follow-up questions